I never thought I'd be the one to tell this story. It's a story that's been twisted and turned so many times. It's hard to know what's real and what's just a rumor. But here I am, telling you the truth about Elvis Presley, about the man behind the legends, the myths, and the endless debates. It was August 16th, 1977. I remember it like it was yesterday. The sun was scorching, and the air was thick with the kind of humidity that makes you feel like you're drowning in the heat. I was at Graceland, Elvis's beautiful mansion in Memphis, Tennessee. It was a place that felt like a sanctuary, but on that day it turned into a house of horrors. I woke up early, as I always did, to the sound of Elvis's laughter echoing through the halls. But this morning there was no laughter, there was only silence. A silence so deep, it felt like the world had stopped spinning. I walked down the hallway, my heart pounding, and pushed open the door to Elvis's room. What I saw will haunt me forever. Elvis was lying on the floor, his body lifeless, his eyes closed. It was like time had frozen, and I was the only one who could hear the ticking of the clock. I screamed, and the house came alive with chaos. People were running, phones were ringing, and everyone was trying to figure out what had happened. But deep down, we all knew. Elvis Presley was gone. The news spread like wildfire. The world was in shock. How could the king of rock and roll, the man who had changed music forever, be dead at just 42 years old? The media had a field day, speculating about drugs, unhealthy habits, and a life cut short by fame. But they were missing the real story. Elvis's death was no accident. It was a destiny that had been written long before he was born. A destiny that was hidden in the shadows of his family tree. A legacy of genetic flaws that had been passed down for generations. Elvis's mother, Gladys, had died in a similar way when she was only 46. Her death was a tragedy that had left Elvis devastated. He had always been a mama's boy, and losing her had been like losing a part of himself. But what no one knew then was that Gladys and Elvis shared more than just a deep bond. They shared the same faulty DNA, a genetic time bomb that had been ticking since the day they were born. Elvis's maternal grandparents were first cousins. This rare and dangerous combination of genes had created a unique but fragile individual. While Elvis was gifted with an incredible voice and a magnetic personality, his body was a ticking time bomb. The genetic flaws he inherited from both sides of his family had been setting the stage for his early demise from the moment he was conceived. As I stood there, staring at Elvis's lifeless body, I realized that his death was not just a tragedy, it was a warning. A warning about the power of genetics, the importance of family history, and the fragile nature of life itself. In the days and weeks that followed, the world mourned Elvis. But for those of us who were close to him, the pain was deeper. We knew the truth, and we knew that his story was far from over. This is that story. A story of a man who was destined to die young, but who left an indelible mark on the world. A story that needs to be told, so that the truth about Elvis Presley can finally be understood. I grew up hearing stories about my great-grandma Rosella, and I can't help but think about how tough her life was. She was born in 1862, just before the Civil War, and her dad, Dunnan Jr., left her and her sister when they were just babies. He went off to fight in the war, but deserted a couple of times. He ended up marrying more women and leaving them too. When he died, he didn't have much to his name, just a crippled colt and some household goods. Rosella had to raise 10 kids all by herself. She never really talked about who their dads were, and it was a big mystery growing up. She was a sharecropper, which means she worked someone else's land and gave half of what she grew to the landowner. It was a hard life. She had to wake up early to milk the cow, work in the fields all day, and come home late at night. She didn't have much education, but she made sure her kids went to school. My grandpa Jesse, Elvis' dad, was one of Rosella's kids. He left school when he was 11 to find a job. He married my grandma Minnie-Me when he was 16, and they had 5 kids, including my dad, Vernon. Jesse worked hard but moved around a lot, doing different jobs. He was a sharecropper in the summer and a lumberjack in the winter. For a while he owned a house and some land, but he gave that up too. He and Minnie-Me had a rough time, and they ended up getting divorced. Jesse said Minnie-Me left him, but she said he left her and hadn't sent any money in over a year. The Smith and Presley families had a hard time holding onto land. They were always renting, and it was tough to save enough money to buy their own farms. My grandma Minnie Mee's family, the Smiths, had similar struggles. They moved around a lot too, and they were often sharecroppers or tenant farmers. It's hard to imagine how tough it was for them, but it helps me understand where Elvis came from. He grew up in a place where poverty was passed down from one generation to the next. His family's story shows just how much hard work and struggle went into making him the person he became. Even though they faced so many challenges, they never gave up, and that's something I think about a lot when I think about Elvis. My great-great-great-great-grandfathers, Andrew Presley, Jr. and Richard Mansell, both fought in the American Revolutionary War. They were from South Carolina, and their bravery and patriotism ran deep in our family. This spirit of patriotism was something that Elvis would carry with him throughout his life. One of Richard Mansell's sons, William, ended up in Tennessee and later moved to northeast Alabama. He fought in 2 wars against the Indians under Andrew Jackson. William's wife, Mourning Dove White, was a full-blooded Cherokee Indian. In those days, it wasn't unusual for pioneer men to marry Native American women. Mourning Dove's name included White to show she was friendly, which was important at a time when Native Americans were often labeled as red if they were seen as enemies. William and Mourning Dove settled in a place called Hamilton in Marion County, Alabama. They had 3 children, a daughter named Mourning and 2 sons, John and James. Tragically, Mourning Dove died shortly after giving birth to James in 1835. Their firstborn son, John, inherited the farm and later became known for his restless nature and his Indian ways. He had many children, both legitimate and illegitimate, and eventually left Alabama with his 2 wives and moved to Mississippi. In Mississippi, John's son, White Mansell, became the head of the family. White had a big family to take care of, including his daughter, Octavia Lavinia, who was later known as Doll and became Elvis' grandmother. White's sister, Anne, also joined the family in Mississippi and married a man named Obe Smith. They had 7 children, but Obe never provided a stable home, so Anne eventually left him and moved in with her brother White. White and Anne's families lived and worked on a sharecropper's farm called the Hussey Farm. Sharecropping was a tough way of life. Families worked the land for a share of the crops, but they rarely made enough to get ahead. The economic depression of the 1890s made things even harder. Land was everything in the South. If you owned land, you had a chance. If you didn't, you were trapped in a cycle of poverty. 2 of White and Anne's children, Robert Lee Smith, known as Bob and Doll, fell in love and got married in 1903. They were first cousins, which wasn't unusual in those days, especially in rural areas. Many families married within their own kin to keep things close and to deal with the hardships of poverty. Bob and Doll's life as sharecroppers was incredibly tough. They moved from farm to farm, always trying to make ends meet. Doll was known for her beauty and her playful nature, while Bob was seen as a hardworking, moral man. They lived in simple shacks without electricity or running water. The heat in the summer was unbearable, and they had to deal with insects and other pests. Their first child, Effie, was born in 1904, but only lived for 14 months. Shortly after, Doll fell ill with what was thought to be tuberculosis. TB was a deadly disease back then, and it was common for people to die within 5 years of being diagnosed. Doll, however, lived for over 30 years with the disease, which was quite remarkable. Despite her illness, she rarely left her bed, and Bob had to work even harder to support the family. Bob walked 7 miles each day to a winter job digging a ditch, and then he would walk 7 miles back home. He was a devoted husband and father, trying his best to provide for his family in a world that made it nearly impossible. The family often moved in the middle of the night when they couldn't pay their debts, carrying only what they could manage. This was the life that Elvis' maternal grandparents, Bob and Doll Smith, lived. It was a life of hard work, poverty, and family. Despite the challenges, they stayed together and tried to make the best of their situation. Their story is a part of Elvis' legacy, a reminder of the struggles and resilience of his ancestors. I grew up in a family that knew hardship like the back of their hands. My great-grandma Doll was sick for as long as anyone could remember. She had a disease called alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency, or alpha-1 for short. It's a genetic condition that can mess with your lungs and liver. Back in the day, no one knew what it was, so they called it all sorts of things: tuberculosis, hepatitis, copped. Doll had it bad. Despite her illness, she gave birth to 9 kids, including my grandma Gladys. Growing up, Gladys and her siblings had to work the fields and take care of their mom. Life was tough. They were poor, and in the 1920s, Mississippi got even poorer. The price of cotton dropped, and many farmers like my great-grandpa Bob became sharecroppers. They worked hard, but it was never enough. Bob was strong, but in 1931, he suddenly went blind and died of pneumonia. Everyone thought Doll would be the first to go, but she kept hanging on. The family had to scatter, and Gladys, who was 19 at the time, had to take care of her younger siblings and their sick mom. They moved to East Tupelo, where Gladys found a job at the Tupelo garment plant. She worked long hours sewing, but it meant they had a roof over their heads and a steady income. That's where she met my grandpa Vernon. They were both young and hopeful, dreaming of a better life. They got married 2 months after they met, lying about their ages so they could get the marriage license. Gladys said she was 19 when she was really 21, and Vernon said he was 22 when he was 17. They were just trying to make things work. Life in Tupelo was hard. The Great Depression hit everyone, but the South had been struggling for a long time. Electricity and modern conveniences were still rare. People grew their own food and relied on each other. Vernon and Gladys were no different. They had simple dreams: a house, a few kids, and enough money to get by. They didn't know that their son, Elvis, would one day become famous and change everything. In 1935, Elvis was born in a tiny house in East Tupelo. The town was small, and everyone knew each other. Elvis grew up surrounded by his extended family, the Smiths and the Presleys. They were close and relied on each other for support. Life was tough, but they always had each other. As Elvis got older, he started to show signs of the same health issues that plagued his family. He was a carrier of Alpha-1, just like his mom. Even though he became famous and had everything, he always knew that his family's history of illness might catch up with him. He visited his mom's gravesite often, and he often said he wouldn't live longer than she did. In Tupelo, Elvis was just another kid, helping out at home and dreaming of something more. It was a place where the ordinary became the extraordinary, and where the struggles of the past shaped the future. Life in Tupelo, Mississippi, during the 1930s was tough. My dad, Vernon, and my mom, Gladys, were no strangers to hard work. In 1934, the per capita income tax paid by Mississippians was only 34 cents. President Franklin D. Roosevelt called the South the nation's #1 economic problem. The New Deal was coming with lots of work programs, but life for my family was still a struggle. Mom worked long hours at the Tupelo Garment Company, using a sewing machine to meet daily quotas. She was strong and lively, always full of spunk. Even though she worked so much, she still took care of her invalid mother, who had tuberculosis. Mom would sew nightgowns for her, and help out in any way she could. My mom was known for being a great neighbor and a natural storyteller. She could cheer anyone up with a good laugh. After they got married, my parents moved in with my grandpa, Jesse. When Mom got pregnant in 1934, Dad borrowed $180 to build a house. He and his family built a 2-room shotgun house, which was small but better than what they had before. The house was 15 feet by 30 feet, with one room leading to the other. It was simple, but it gave us a place to call home. In 1935, there were still around 20,000 former slaves living in Mississippi. Our house was small and had no plumbing or electricity. The walls were bare, and the drafts in winter made us glad to be in the South. Life was hard, and every day was filled with work. My Uncle Vester would wake up at 4 in the morning to milk the cows, work in the fields, and then do it all over again. My cousin Annie remembered using a scrub board and tubs to wash clothes. There was no time for leisure. Every moment was spent working to survive. Sickness was a constant worry, and there was no money for medical care. Despite the hardships, people in Tupelo were proud and resilient. They knew they were doing the best they could. My dad, Vernon, was no exception. He struggled to provide for us, but he never gave up. He was always proud of who we were and what we had. Religion played a big role in our lives. We believed in divine providence, which helped us understand our hardships and gave us hope. When I was born on January 8, 1935, my twin brother, Jesse, didn't make it. It was a shock and a deep loss for my parents, but they found comfort in their faith. By the time I was 10, my dad believed that I was meant to be their only child. There are different stories about whether Mom knew she was having twins. Some say she knew, while others say it was a surprise. Either way, the community came together to support us. My mom's friends at the garment factory gave her a baby shower, and the community's generosity became a part of my life. When I was born, Dr. Hunt, a kind old doctor, delivered me. He had delivered nearly 1,000 babies in Tupelo. My parents must have been scared, but they trusted him. I was tiny, weighing only about 5 pounds, and Mom had lost a lot of blood. We stayed in the hospital for 3 weeks, which was unusual for those times. The community was there for us, and people came to visit. A neighbor girl, Catherine, was surprised to see that Jesse looked like any other baby. There were no visible signs of why he didn't survive, which made it even harder to understand. Despite the hardships, my parents were strong and loving. They worked hard to give me a better life, and their resilience and faith shaped who I became. Elvis and we were born on a Tuesday morning, January 8, 1935, but I didn't make it. I was stillborn, and they buried me in an unmarked grave in Priceville Cemetery, right in Tupelo. They think I'm probably buried next to our great-grandpa Noah Presley. My dad, Noah, took care of the whole family, and my Uncle Larry has no doubt that he handled my burial. It wouldn't have made sense to give a tiny baby like me a whole plot, so they likely put me at the head or foot of an adjacent grave. At the time, the only other person in the family plot was Noah's daughter, Oma Cedra Presley, who passed away in 1932 at the age of 18. When my grandma Susan Griffin Presley died in 1939, they buried her next to Oma. Later, in 1969, they placed great-grandpa Noah next to his first wife. My family couldn't afford a gravestone back then, just like they couldn't afford a winding sheet for my great-grandpa Bob a few years earlier. But I eventually got a fancy marker at the meditation garden at Graceland, surrounded by everyone else who was in the room that day when I was stillborn. The day after Elvis was born, the good ladies of Tupelo came to help. Janelle McComb, a lifelong friend of the Presleys, remembers how her mom brought a diaper layette to the Presleys because they were in a tight spot. Even from the start, Elvis had a community that cared for him. Guy Harris, a childhood friend, recalled, "It was a community that took care of each other." Dr. Hunt, who delivered Elvis and me, passed away in 1952. He never knew that he brought one of the most famous babies in history into the world. If he had read the horoscope in the Memphis Commercial Appeal on January 8, 1935, he might have gotten a hint. It said, "You should have remarkable powers of expression in music and poetry. If the full powers of your mind are executed, you may easily become a benefactor to mankind." Elvis had the stars on his side from the very beginning. Dr. Hunt's daughter, Sarah, said, "If you lived in Mississippi back then and had good parents who believed in things, you didn't mind so much. Elvis had good parents who believed in him." Over time, people started to create stories about me. Jesse Garon Presley. Some said I was a big part of Elvis' life, that he talked to me all the time. Even a movie showed Elvis talking to his shadow, which they called Jesse. But the truth is, Elvis didn't think about me much. He didn't know life any other way than being an only child. Cousin Billy Smith said, "Elvis would say he was born dead. I never knew him." Gladys, Elvis' mom, wished I could have lived. She thought it would have been good for Elvis to have a playmate. But she and Vernon, Elvis' dad, didn't have time to dwell on my loss. They had to focus on survival. Johnny Cash, who lost his brother in a table saw accident, said his family went back to work the day after the funeral. That's how it was back then. You didn't have the luxury of mourning. My stillbirth might have been because of how close my grandparents were related. When parents are closely related, there's a higher chance of passing on unhealthy genes. This happened in Queen Victoria's family, where her son and grandsons died from hemophilia, a blood-clotting disorder. Males have a higher chance of inheriting these defective genes because they only get one X chromosome from their mother. Females get two, so they have a backup. Elvis got that one defective set from Gladys, and it might explain why Gladys and her sisters had health issues, and why Gladys died young at 46. Vernon and Gladys only had Elvis, and they never found out why they couldn't have more kids. Gladys did miscarry at least once. My Aunt Klutz and Uncle Vester, who were first cousins, also only had one child, Patsy. This suggests that the Presley and Smith DNA didn't mix well, leading to fewer successful pregnancies. Despite the struggles, Vernon, Gladys, and Elvis became a family of 3. They worked hard and protected each other. Vernon's sister, Nash, remembered their mom saying, "We almost lost Gladys." After giving birth to twins, Gladys had a hard time. She had bad nerves, and sometimes needed medicine to help her sleep. Mothers who give birth to twins have a higher risk of postpartum issues, which can cause depression, weight gain, and fatigue. The year 1935 brought progress to Tupelo. Within a year, the town got its first hospital, radio station, and airport. The Works Progress Administration, WPA, built many new structures, changing the landscape of the South. But 1935 was also a tough year for Gladys. She lost her grandmother and her own mom, Doll, who had been sick for a long time. Gladys was strong, but she worried about everyone. She and Elvis's extended family in Tupelo were tough and hardworking. They had to be. A little luck helped too. In 1936, a historic tornado hit Tupelo, but the Presleys made it through. Life was hard, but they kept going, just like everyone else in those times. Elvis' first Christmas could have been a white one, but most years in Tupelo don't see much snow. The winter of 1935 to 1936 was different, with 14.8 inches of snow. That winter was wild. In February, the temperature dropped to 3 degrees Fahrenheit, and by June, it soared to 108 degrees Fahrenheit. In the middle of all this, the historic Tupelo tornado hit on April 5, 1936. It was one of the deadliest tornadoes in U.S. history, leveling 48 city blocks and over 200 homes. At least 216 people died, and more than 700 were injured. The tornado's wind speeds were over 261 miles per hour. There was no radar to warn us. We just had the strange behavior of farm animals to alert us. When the tornado struck, my mom, Gladys, held little Elvis as the house shook. My family gathered at my grandparents' house to wait out the storm. We were lucky. We survived with minimal damage. After the tornado, Tupelo went back to being a small town where not much happened. My Aunt Annie Presley said, "There wasn't a whole lot to do back in those days in East Tupelo. No traffic lights, no excitement. East Tupelo, where we lived, was on the other side of the tracks. The dividing line was U.S. Highway 78. My parents, Vernon and Gladys, worked hard to make ends meet. They found ways to earn money, stretch food, and care for Elvis. We were a tight-knit family, and sometimes people thought we were too isolated, but we just had our own little world. We were active in the church, especially in 1937, when Uncle Gaines Mansell was the preacher at the Assembly of God Church. We shared everything, even the bed. Many families in the 1930s did the same. We moved a lot, about a dozen times in Elvis' first 13 years. We didn't have a permanent place to call home, but we always had each other and the community in East Tupelo. Dad, Vernon, had a tough reputation as a loafer, but he stayed with us. Many men left their families, but not Vernon. He wanted to provide for us and be the father Elvis needed. In 1937, though, things went wrong. Dad and Uncle Travis sold a hog to Orville Bean, who held the mortgage on our house. They forged a check, and Dad was arrested. He couldn't afford bail, so he stayed in jail for 6 months. Uncle Noah tried to help, but Mr. Bean didn't budge. On May 25, 1938, Dad was sentenced to 3 years in prison. Mom and 3-year-old Elvis were left to fend for themselves. The community rallied around us. When Dad was arrested, the sheriff told Mom she had to leave the house in 24 hours because we were behind on the mortgage. We stayed with family, and the church and community helped us. Uncle Noah, who was like a hero to everyone, stepped up. He owned a grocery store and gave us food. He also had an old school bus that he used to take people to school and work. He even took kids to the Memphis Zoo. When Mom visited Dad in prison, Uncle Noah took them in that bus. He was always there for us. Mom, Gladys, had a tough time. She lost her parents, a son, a sister, and a cousin's baby between 1931 and 1941. When Dad was in prison, she was alone with Elvis. She wrote letters asking for Dad's early release. even Mr. Bean wrote a letter. Dad was released in February 1939, after serving a little over 8 months. The community quickly forgot about his prison time. Mom changed after Dad went to prison. She was always lively, but then she became nervous and anxious. Life was a struggle, but she was strong and determined to survive. She relied on her faith and helped others, just like she did when my Aunt Annie lost her baby. Elvis saw how much the community cared for us. He learned to share and help others, just like Uncle Noah and the people in East Tupelo. Even though we didn't have much, we always had each other and the support of our neighbors. As I look back on those early years in Tupelo, I see a family that struggled but never gave up. My parents, Vernon and Gladys, worked hard to make ends meet, but life was tough. We moved from place to place, sometimes staying with relatives or renting small homes. My dad couldn't always find steady work, and we had a hard time paying rent. There were times when we barely had enough to get by, but we always had hope. My mom and dad were committed to my education. They didn't have much schooling themselves, but they knew it was important for me to finish school. On my first day of first grade, they made it clear that I would graduate from high school. It was a promise that shaped my future. In East Tupelo, I was just another kid. I had a strong sense of humor like my dad, but I wasn't the class clown. I knew to respect my elders and follow the rules. My mom was protective, but not more than other moms. She let me go out to play and explore, just like any other kid. I had to do chores, like carrying water from the community wells and running errands for my mom. Even as a young boy, I dreamed of providing for my family. I told my mom I would buy her a big house and lots of food when I grew up. It was a dream that kept me going through the hard times. Our family always had enough to eat, even if it wasn't what we wanted. We grew our own vegetables and raised chickens, just like other families in East Tupelo. My mom and the other ladies in the neighborhood were creative with what they had. They made clothes and sheets from flour sacks, and we all wore them. I mostly wore overalls or coveralls, but I was always neat and clean. Respect was a big deal in our house. I was taught to be well-mannered, not to talk back, and to act with integrity. I had severe asthma and bad dreams as a kid. My parents tried to help me with home remedies, like milk of magnesia for my stomach problems. I also had tonsillitis a lot, but we couldn't afford to have my tonsils removed. My parents would pray for me, and that gave them comfort. My mom, Gladys, had health issues too, but she never talked about them. She was always there for me, and she always believed in me. When I started 7th grade at Millam Junior High, I realized that our family was considered lower class. I made friends with other kids from similar backgrounds, and we stuck together. My mom bought me my first guitar around that time, and I took it to school every day. Music became my escape and my dream. We moved around a lot, and one of the toughest moves was to a shack in an alley. My mom realized that we couldn't make ends meet there. A few months later, we moved to a house in a respectable colored neighborhood. It was a mixed area where poor whites and poor blacks lived side by side. We all faced the same struggles, and we all relied on God to see us through. Those early years in Tupelo were hard, but they made me who I am. They taught me the value of hard work, respect, and never giving up. They also showed me that no matter how tough things get, there's always hope. And that's the lesson I carried with me into the rest of my life.